Hello, everybody. We're back for another archetype discussion. This is part AP. What part is this now?
Go away. You know what? Why don't you just name that? Name this one. The part that I obviously skipped.
Oops.
You're so
Well,
mean.
we are humanities types here. And we did warn people we'd have trouble counting after 10.
After 10.
Yeah. In case you didn't know, AP did skip number 12, I believe it was, which I have named the archetype discussion on the void because it is nowhere to be found. So that's part 12. So this is part 14 because part 13 was on your channel, A Critical Dragon. So so here we are, part 12. And guess what it is, everybody? It is the monstrous other. So orcs and trolls and beasties and that sort of thing. We're going to extend it probably fairly broadly within fantasy. But the monstrous other is the starting point here for this. So AP, welcome to the channel. It is so great to see you.
Oh yeah, make fun of me first, and then and by the way, welcome. Thank you so much, Philip.
That's how we do it. That's how we do it. So let's begin. I guess I will let you speak first about the purpose. What historically, because it's a huge topic, isn't it? The monstrous other, but I think we can go through the ages and look at this happening in storytelling, and there are various reasons behind it, and I think some very interesting psychological reasons for it.
And we're going to be, I think, focusing on the monstrous other predominantly, but othering as a characteristic or as a trope, something that happens in storytelling,
Yeah.
is when you essentially take some group, something, some representative that is different to the core group or whatever setup that you have, and you distinguish the two groups. So setting up a story in America, and then you would have, say, I come over to America, and you have the Americans, and then the Irish guy, and the Irish guy is distanced, made different, made into an other, does not conform to the social norms or the cultural norms or the physical norms. All of these are different ways of setting someone or something or some group apart from the norm. Right. And so you establish a base norm, and then you say that the others are othered. They are different. They are not part of that. So that's broadly speaking the very broadest, most general way of approaching it. And when we talk about the monstrous other, we see this very much when an other is established. In order to make the homogenous group or the natural group or the native group seem better, you make the other into a monster. You demonize your opponent. You turn them into a monster. And obviously in fantasy, quite often it is literalized. So the orcs, the trolls, in Dracula, vampires, all of these are different ways of literalizing that difference and making it seem negative and pejorative. You turn it into a monstrous other. So that's the standard technique, and it is applied. I think we're going to go through obviously a whole load of different examples in different ways that they're being applied. Sometimes it's about literalizing a fear or an anxiety about social groups or cultural groups or racial groups, and therefore the author or storyteller demonizes that group. Sometimes it's reflecting a cultural norm or regurgitating a stereotype and exaggerating it because people, the readership of the time, will identify with it, will understand it, and it plays into a cultural bias of the time. And you can see how these can be used. And just as clearly, once you understand that, you can see how it can be subverted, particularly in the modern day.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a big topic, really, othering, and there are lots of ways to approach it. For example, another approach could be to approach it by talking about gender. There's a gender aspect to othering, or sexuality for that matter. Very much an aspect of othering that has been done quite a lot in the past. So gender is huge, though. You could name any number of important stories, great stories that portray an aspect of gendered othering. But we are today focusing on the monstrous other. So
Well, hang on. Before we get into that, if you want an innocuous example of setting up that difference, particularly in gendering,
yeah,
men are from Mars and women are from Venus.
yeah,
Two different species, everyone. You go setting up that distinction, saying that they are different and emphasizing that difference instead of emphasizing the commonality of humanity,
right.
focusing on differences. And then obviously when we talk about monstrous othering, it's in a very negative and pejorative sense.
Yeah.
But there's a slightly different form of it, which we could probably do in a different video, which would be about orientalizing, which
Yes. Yeah.
again is an aspect of othering, but with a slightly different focus. But let's focus on the monstrous other.
Yeah, because all of these things have the common purpose historically of raising up the in-group while disparaging outsiders. So it's a very tribal aspect to othering. But focusing on the monstrous other, one of the early examples, one that is familiar to me and I think would be to most of our viewers, Beowulf is
I am shocked, Philip. You're going to go to Beowulf as an example for something?
It's in the wheelhouse, man. It's in the wheelhouse.
Didn't see that one coming.
Hey, careful. I'm going to start reciting it in Old English. All right. Okay. So anyway, it's a very dualistic story. There's good and evil. There's light and dark. So Beowulf is set up that way right from the get-go. And the monstrous other, the most famous example there, of course, is Grendel. And of course, you have Grendel's mother. And there's some very interesting gendered aspects to her otherness as well. But primarily, it's Grendel and Grendel's mother, who is not named in the story. And they are presented right from the beginning as creatures of darkness, creatures of chaos, in contrast to civilization. So Hrothgar has built Heorot as a refuge, as a place in which he protects the values of that society. It is seen as the king is doing his duty by providing this place, this safe place in which civilization can thrive. And interestingly, the Shope, the bard, is singing a song of creation to celebrate the building of Heorot in the beginning. And this, it's not that Grendel hates noise, it's that Grendel can't stand the concept of creation, which is imposing order on the world. Grendel is a creature of chaos and darkness. And this is
that you have to remember, that is what the narrative would have you believe. But clearly the narrative is by another bloody shop, and therefore he's defending his mate. And it's not that the song and whole performance was truly terrible. Okay.
You don't offend the bards, because they're the ones that tell the stories. So yeah. So Grendel is he's the monstrous other. He comes out of the darkness, comes from the chaos, because he can't stand order. And of course, the hero was the one who defends order and civilization in this case. So it's very binary, very dualistic in the case of Grendel. And of course, you've had lots of retellings of this story. John Gardner's Grendel, for example, which takes a very different perspective, takes the perspective of the other. And this is one aspect of, or one way in which we see this archetype subverted a lot in modern times. We'll get to some fantasies that do that. But I think Beowulf is a great sort of classic example of the monstrous other in Grendel.
So moving slightly closer to the modern day, and therefore outside of your wheelhouse. I thought I would mention H.P. Lovecraft. And Lovecraft is a very divisive figure, particularly in fantasy.
Yeah.
Regardless of his personal politics, his personal life, and his personal beliefs, the impact that he had on the field is extreme. Like it is very, very important. And I can understand people not wanting to read his works or anything like that. But understanding what he was doing with a lot of his beliefs and how that infiltrated his writing. The eldritch horrors he created
Hmm.
are, in a lot of respects, you can see as these literalized metaphors of his anxieties, of the social anxieties that he had, of the racial anxieties that he had, uh, all of these things sort of bubbling up. And he was focused very much on creating monsters from this. And his work is very difficult for a lot of modern readers to engage with because of the anti-Semitic elements, the racial elements, the gendered elements. He is difficult in that sense, but the impact of creating the whole Cthulhu mythos of these eldritch terrors, these horrors, all of this, that you can see so much of his anxieties about what is happening to his perception of sort of white America being literalized. And he really does create these tribal caricatures that are, very offensive about certain segments of, say, African American society. But you can see it as a very clear example of this being applied to social conventions and cultural beliefs, and not just in the sort of metaphorical sense that we have there between chaos and creation in Grendel. It's a different way of sort of seeing this. So I think Lovecraft is important in terms of investigating the other, investigating how his anxieties fueled his dark imagination of these things. And it's not an excuse for his personal life, his personal beliefs, or anything like that. But his work is a great illustration of that essence of othering. And it is, I know it's difficult for people, particularly in the modern day. Sometimes it is not pleasant to read things like this, but it is very informative. It is insightful. So I thought I would bring that up. We don't need to focus on it in any sort of particular fashion. We can move on to something far more palatable, but I thought it was an important one to bring up.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, just in the evolution of this concept within fantasy, another big one to talk about is obviously Lord of the Rings, where you have orcs, you have trolls, you have goblins, you have all the monstrous others you want. And they are pretty much straight up others in Lord of the Rings, where you don't, and there, I know that there are nuances in Lord of the Rings. You have Gollum, for example, who has hints of moments when he seems redeemable and human or hobbit-like. So it's not that Tolkien is always simplistic or dualistic, but when we talk about orcs and that sort of thing, I think it's pretty fair to say that you have a very classic example of the monstrous other here, and that they are the baddies, and then there's not much really. We don't lament their deaths in Lord of the Rings. We don't think about them too much as sentient creatures. There are moments when they get some dialogue, but it's really they're portrayed as fairly crude through that dialogue even. So
Yeah, I actually, I think I have a video defending orcs.
do you?
Because in that scene with Merry and Pippin and the orcs,
Yeah.
and you have is it the Uruk-hai, the orcs from Minas Morgul, and the other set of orcs. So they can speak common because they can communicate with the Hobbit. They're
Yeah.
trilingual,
Yeah.
and you go, that's an extensive illustration of how sentient they are, how intelligent they are, and yet they are always irredeemable, corrupted, and evil. You cannot save the orcs. They are a manifestation of this evil corruption.
Right.
When at the Battle of Helm's Deep and the Huron, the trees are herded down, all of the orcs are wiped out, and the heroes celebrate mass genocide. And this is something that obviously postmodernism deconstructs a lot of these texts, and we take them apart to look at them in these different angles. That is not what Tolkien was doing. He was using them very much as between good and evil. This is a symbol and a metaphor for evil. But because they are sentient, because they actually treat their prisoners better than the heroes treat their prisoners. Oh, that's right. The heroes don't take prisoners; they just execute them.
They're orcs. Yeah.
But it's fascinating, and then we get into some of the racial othering that is present in Tolkien, because of course you have the good people, the Riders of Rohan, the Men of Gondor, Strider's people, with the Men of Numenor.
Yeah.
And then you have on the other side, on the side of Mordor, the Easterlings and the Southrons.
Yeah.
And we see a lot of that cultural bias that was present that Tolkien picked up, and Tolkien used thoughtlessly, because he was representing a cultural bias of the time. Right. Not to excuse it, but again, this was written at a very different time, when this was not the same cultural concern and given the same weight and import that we do today. Right. And it is important to recognize that. Yeah. But it is, again, it's one of those aspects that can be upsetting as a modern reader going into it and going, well, hang on a second, this is a bit strange. But times change, cultures change, our perception of what is important changes. And that is something to bear in mind. But you can see how the orcs are set up as truly monstrous and irredeemable, because in contrast, in sharp relief, we have the heroes. And because you have that mirroring, because you have that darkness on one side and light on the other, it is a very nice, straightforward binary. And it is easier to understand, and you can see why it gets used that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a match between the physical and the moral, and in these portrayals. So the monstrous other is literalized in physical form. And of course, orcs have been used in different ways, in different contexts. There's a book that I haven't read yet, but called Orconomics, which I understand does some interesting things with the whole concept of orcs and all that. But another series with something I think very similar that came later, obviously, than Lord of the Rings, but does something similar, is Wheel of Time, which is everybody's excited about the show. We're going to watch the show, I think, right? And perhaps even discuss it a bit. We'll see about that. But the fact is, Wheel of Time has something very similar in Trollocs and in the Myrddraal, and it's, I think it's fair to say that you have a fairly, again, we're going to later talk about subversions, but Wheel of Time gives us another pretty dualistic. I know there are nuances and complexities that we can get into, especially when it comes to the arcs of the good characters, because they are tempted and they have moments when the power could be dangerous or abused, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying there's no nuance, but in these creatures, you have, I think, a fairly straightforward portrayal of the other in traditional terms. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and of course, like, they could be set up almost in direct opposition to the Ogier, who, are, while they are big and different and not human, are clearly, they're all good. Yeah. There isn't an evil one of them. Right. And there isn't a good Trolloc. Yeah. Binaries, dyads, poles on this, but there's no spectrum. Humans, on the other hand, in the Wheel of Time, do have movement between them, but even when we talk about the Forsaken, again, it's pretty kind of clear cut. Yeah. It seems to be only on the good side is there movement. On everyone else is just, so on the good side, bit of a range. On the evil side, yeah, they're all evil. Yeah. But, and again, you can understand why this is a powerful technique, because you can get the reader to identify with one side and go, you're on this side, you're part of the good. And look at all those, it's clear cut, it's simple, it's straightforward. It gives a focus for why you fight. It gives a focus for why you're going on the quest. It elevates your purpose. It gives it more importance because you're defeating evil. And it removes a lot of that absolute complexity that the real world actually possesses, because this is narrative. Narrative is, in a lot of ways, a lot more simplified than the real world.
Yep, absolutely. Let's do then at least one more example of a more traditional portrayal of othering, although I think this one is a little more complex. This one is, I think, kind of might be interesting to talk about. And then we'll move into the subversions. And maybe this is no accident, but several of the subversions of the othering that we're going to talk about are by women authors. So I don't think that maybe is an accident, whereas the more traditional portrayals seem to be coming from men. And we're not getting into the specifics of the gendered form of othering here, but I don't think it's an accident that the examples we came up with are 3 of the 4 are by women. So, but anyway, Stormlight Archive is so Brandon Sanderson was involved in the Wheel of Time. He finished the series for Brandon Sanderson for Robert Jordan, and I'm kind of interested in what he does with the Parshendi in the Stormlight Archive, because here I see an attempt to do something a bit more complex than Trolloc bad. I think with the Parshendi, he even gives a POV from the Parshendi. So I think he's trying to move away from that traditional dualistic, good bad kind of setup here. And with the Parshendi, we get their perspective. We see them actually as, in some ways, even victims of the aggression of the human cultures that are near them. So I think that there's a little bit more to discuss when it comes to what Brandon Sanderson is doing in Stormlight Archive. Would you agree with that?
You're going to get me in trouble again.
Uh-oh.
No, I understand your point.
Yeah.
And I can see what you're getting at.
Yeah.
But in the Stormlight Archive, as in Mistborn and in the whole of the Cosmere, there is an entity that is pure evil.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And everything is basically, all of the good guys are being set up in opposition to this. And
Right.
some people get co-opted into acting on behalf of. It is still set up in this binary of we are the good guys, they are the bad guys. You still have, for the most part, an Anglophone association with good, and a darker version in melanin content for bad.
True.
No, it is not that straight. I am going to get into trouble for this.
But sorry.
Sanderson does start taking this apart, but I don't think it is as well developed and as sophisticated as a lot of us would perhaps desire. And he still has that core belief of there are good entities, there are evil entities, and the things that work on behalf of evil, that have sold their souls to evil, they are truly evil. And you still have that aspect of othering. Think of the evil version of Spren, the Void Spren.
Sure.
Yeah. It's not as clear cut, say, as Tolkien. It is more nuanced than Tolkien. Yeah. But we're not getting into a full, oh yes, this is a modern sophisticated treatment of this concept of othering. There are aspects of that Sanderson is doing.
Yeah, so I thought that would be an interesting segue into some of the stories where we do have much more complete subversions, where you have much more of a follow through on this concept of flipping this whole script. And I agree with you that Sanderson doesn't go all the way, but that he does.
Yeah. I mean, the series is still being written. We haven't seen where it's going. We don't know where it is going to end up. So, I would hold off judgment on it until he finishes. That seems only fair.
Fair enough. Absolutely, based on what we've seen so far, I guess. So, but to take an example of someone who I think completely subverts the trope and does something very original with it. Let's take a look at A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin, where slight spoilers, I guess, if you haven't read A Wizard of Earthsea here, we'll try to keep it vague. But what happens in that book, in A Wizard of Earthsea, and she does it in later books too, in other ways, I think, where you do have a feminist author who gives us a great take on gendered forms of othering as well, later in the series, not so much in A Wizard of Earthsea, but in A Wizard of Earthsea, you have the Monstrous Other. And what's interesting to me is how Le Guin flips that and into a place where the reader is forced to see this more as a mirror than as a foreign entity. Like, we're looking at the other and suddenly we realize, oh wait, that's me there. And and the other is me. And so I think it's a really fascinating take on this othering, that she really does like two sides of a coin kind of thing in there. And there's a Taoist element to what she's doing in there, the yin yang kind of thing. So I just think it's really a really cool example.
Yeah, and like Le Guin's writing, particularly a lot of her science fiction,
Mm-hmm.
is absolutely brilliant. How she plays with Western bias and Western accepted cultural norms, and turns them on their head, and investigates them, and plays with them, and tries to tease them all apart. Um, and even in Earthsea, using Native Americans as the inspiration for the heroic figures,
Mm,
and a lot of the good figures not being white, and in fact a lot of the evil figures in the world
yeah.
that we see later on, in particular, are Anglophone.
The Kargish. Yeah. Yeah.
So and this is just straight almost, you could almost go, it's straight up just swapping the color of the skin. And yet for a lot of Western audiences at that time, that was mind-blowing, because, oh, hang on a sec, I'm not the hero in this.
Mm,
And you can understand, like, I know there's a lot of outcry in certain circles about, say, gender swapping a character in a film, or changing the race of a character in a film. And when you look at a Wizard of Earthsea, and when you see that response of people suddenly go, but hang on, how come I am not the hero? Imagine you've spent your whole life, all media that you've ever consumed, where you are never the hero, where you're always the bad guy.
yeah.
And then finding a book in which you are the hero. The hero is someone who looks like you.
Yeah.
And that, I think, was part of what Le Guin was trying to do, was trying to raise awareness of, was trying to uh, get across to people who, because they are part of a dominant culture, had never experienced.
Yep.
And
Yep.
that is something to recognize about othering. It is not necessarily saying, oh, white people bad.
Right.
I think we're all adults now. We've graduated beyond simplistic knee-jerk reactions, and we can actually look at why does it make us feel uncomfortable when a white character is suddenly no longer white? What does that then say about all of these other things? Do we feel that way when, oh, look, there's another Middle Eastern terrorist, or another Irish terrorist, or there's another German bad guy, or, when we see these things are stereotypes. And when it doesn't affect us, when it's not a stereotype of who we are,
Mm-hmm.
we go, oh yeah, but that's just a stereotype. Now imagine being of the culture that is being stereotyped.
Right. Right.
And that is the power of othering. That is the power to make you feel that you are not part of the conversation, that you are the object
That's right.
that
Yeah.
is being picked apart.
And that's one reason why I think Le Guin was upset when I think it was the sci-fi series adaptation, where the character playing Ged was white. And she was actually quite vocal about her distress and anger about that decision. So yeah, whoops. Well, another great series, fantasy. I call it fantasy, you call it sci-fi. Is Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, where
Point of order.
Yes.
I would never call it sci-fi. I would call it science fiction or SF. Never sci-fi.
Okay.
We can talk about that later when we're off air.
Okay, we'll do that then. We shall do that. But in the meantime, whatever we're calling it, Broken Earth, I think, is a great example of taking that otherizing, the instinct, or the whatever it is to otherize, and really doing something interesting with it, because you here have a story where the main character and the characters we sympathize with are the monstrous other in the eyes of that society. The Origines, the ones who are able to use magic, fantasy, are also known in a derogatory fashion as rogas, and that's almost like a swear word. It's very deliberately portrayed that way. It's an ugly word. And so Jemisin does a brilliant job, I think, of incorporating a very different take from the perspective of the other, and giving us this story, which is, I think, very relevant to our own times and place in so many ways. So yeah, it's a great story, isn't it, AP?
Yeah, and you can see so much in that, even just in the first book. And again, it's playing with this perception of what is the norm, what is being othered, why is it being othered, why is that being distinguished? And then when you're asked to identify with the other, what does that say about the cultural norm? Again, playing with these questions, asking these questions, and forcing the reader who may or may not have ever contemplated to actually think through the ramifications of this.
Yep.
And she does it masterfully. She's a brilliant writer.
Yeah, brilliant. A couple more examples, and the next one, another brilliant writer, one we talk about fairly often, Robin Hobb. In The Live Ship Traders, we have an interesting story, an arc in there of Malta, who initially sees a certain group of people as others, as monstrous, and her story is one of evolving in order to, her perceptions change drastically in the course of the trilogy, and later on in the Rainwild Chronicles as well, I believe. But that I haven't read yet, so I've only read Live Ship Traders myself. So,
and this goes back to one of the early points that you made about the physicality reflecting a moral component. And you know, we've seen this throughout history. I talked about Dracula recently, where because Dracula is described as hairy and smelly and all of these things, you go, oh yeah, that's all the language that we use for immigrants. You can see how that language is employed to turn the subject into a monster, to make them less than human. And with Malta, we have that, the difference, the physical differences. And of course, she starts with that unthinking coded behavior of that difference is monstrous, it is bad. And then she learns about it. She learns to appreciate it. She then comes to understand it better. And it no longer is a signifier of monstrosity. And that, I think, is such a subtle and powerful thing that gets worked through that storyline. Because so often that almost that Victorian sensibility of, oh, they look, Tolkien did this. Well, you know that moment when Frodo meets Aragorn, and it's, oh, well, you may look, it's a bad guy would have looked fair but felt foul. And of course Aragorn jokes, so I look foul and feel fair. But playing into that sensibility that there is a physical manifestation of your moral center, which is clearly ridiculous. And yet it is used so often that we buy into it so often without thinking. And it's brilliant when something like that gets played with, gets interrogated, and gets turned on its head to show it in a very different light. We see it even in The Expanse. The group of people who live on the asteroid belt, the Belters, because they live in, a lot of them live in very lower gravity, will be taller, will have longer spines, they will look different to Earthers or the Martians because of the different environment they grew up in. And they're very much, you can see how they are viewed because of these physical differences as different, as otherized. We see this time and time again.
Wow. Well, AP, we can't talk about this without mentioning Stephen Erickson and Ian Esselmont. The Malazan books are just fantastic because of how they treat the other. And you literally have a spin on orcs, I think it's fair to say, with the Jagat in a way. Very different from what your standard orc is, that's for sure. Or trells, for example. I think it's pretty obvious they're trolls, right? I mean, so you have orcs and trolls in the Malazan world in the form of Jagats and trells, but wow, what a very different take, because often, you know, Mappo Trell is one of the most beloved characters, one of the most sensitive individuals you can find in a series that is famous for many wonderful, lovable characters. So, and the Jagat, I mean, I just love their sense of humor, and they're quirky and And so very different take here. And of course, these guys are famous for upending tropes.
And like to go back again to one of the early points where we had talked about that binary of good versus evil, of light versus dark.
Yeah.
We have that inverted in the Malazan world, because darkness and shadow are almost the forces of good, whereas the forces associated with light aren't portrayed particularly flatteringly.
Yeah.
And a lot of the central characters in the Malazan world are not Anglo. They're not Anglophone in any way. They have different colored skin tones, and people aren't judged by the color of their skin. People aren't judged by how they look. It's all about actions and deeds and the characteristics, and it plays into a lot of that. So it's I think Erickson and Esselmont very much were aware of a lot of the tropes of othering and just went, we have no truck with that. We're anthropologists, we're archaeologists, cultures from all over the world. There's a commonality to humanity. Let's play with that.
Yeah. If we're talking about skin tone, when I'm reading a Malazan book, unless it says otherwise, I'm assuming the character has brown skin. That's just most of the characters do. The exceptions are, the Falaris, and there are some exceptions, but for the most part, it's a very diverse world, first of all, but secondly, I think the majority of the characters are people of color, as we would say in our world. So yeah, so it's wonderful how I think we've gone from a period with unquestioned othering and in a very binary dualistic way to, I think, a much richer and more interesting, I think, period in which we have lots of authors who are now doing something very different with this archetype. So I think that is something to celebrate in fantasy. Wouldn't you say so?
More voices, more stories, more books to read. What is not to like about that? It's a golden age of storytelling, where just think of all of the different types of fantasy we get to read now, all the different types of characters, all the different types of stories. This is a good thing.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing. And you know what another good thing is, AP? Me getting to talk to you about archetypes.
Oh, that's so sweet after being mean to me at the start.
I'm trying to balance it, So,
Thank you very much, Philip. It's great to be here and have these chats.
Awesome. And I had a great time. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And please give us your favorite examples of the monstrous other in the comments. We look forward to hearing from you. All right, everyone. Bye-bye.